I'm Josh Allen, and welcome to the Baked In Podcast, where I sit down with industry innovators to uncover the unique ideas and values that are baked into their businesses and have led to extraordinary success. The podcast is presented by Busey Bank. What I love most about working with Busey, and they've handled my business and personal banking since 2007, is the support. Through the really challenging times, scaling into our new factory, closing cafes, the COVID pandemic, they've had my back. That support sometimes includes a little kick in the rear and a push to think smarter, but it's always done in such a way to reiterate that they're invested in my success. If you're looking for a bank full of great people with a strong dedication to their customers, check out Busey Bank. On today's episode, I have the immense pleasure of chatting with Nicole Indovino of Indovino Wines, a young, energetic, passionate winemaking entrepreneur producing wines in both Spain and Colorado. She also happens to be the daughter of two of my most favorite people in the world, Jill and Jay Indovino, whose generosity and community service via Girls on the Run and Pedal the Cause has always been hugely inspiring to me. It's great to hear Nicole's story of falling in love with agriculture and harvests and the routine and monotony of winemaking, things incredibly familiar to me relative to bread making. We talk about the challenges of launching a business in Spain, making bets on yourself, and how important it is to find a sense of place in what she's doing. Lots of great stuff in this one. Let's roll. So, small world, we both, I think, had our first jobs in our professions working for Joseph Phelps, which I don't know if you knew that, but I worked in 1992. I worked for the Oakville Grocery Company, which Joseph Phelps at the time owned. And so we had a handful of grocery stores on the West Coast, and it was a bakery project that didn't end up moving forward, but I got a chance to meet him once. He was still alive at the time. And I know it looked like that was where your first harvest was at Joseph Phelps?
Yeah, so my first harvest was at Joseph Phelps, but correct me if I'm wrong, Oakville Grocery was actually, their winery is Rudd Oakville Estate, where I did my second harvest.
Oh, okay. Yeah, they're owned by Dean and DeLuca now, so it's all a separate thing now. Well, let's take a step back here. You were a biology major in college, and help me understand the path where you go from biology to making wine in two of the most beautiful regions of the world right now.
Totally. So I studied biology, and at the time I was not drinking any wine in college. I was drinking beer and honestly, whatever I could get my hands on. And I also didn't grow up with a lot of wine in my house. My parents liked to drink wine. They would order it with dinner, but it was never something on holidays where it was, oh, let's open up this vintage from this region. And so my junior year of college, I really wanted to study abroad, but I was kind of behind in the biology major. And so I did this program in Costa Rica where I did a biological experiment on coffee farms there as a way to kind of get credits and work on a thesis. And it was amazing. I fell in love working in agriculture and specialty agriculture and meeting all of the farmers and just being in that world. And so my senior year of college, I started to wonder, what could I do with that? I really was looking into coffee. I even went to Caldi's and talked to them about that. And finally, I was talking with a friend's mom who lived out in Northern California, and she told me, oh, I think you would love working in wine. It's a mixture of art, culture, history, but also agriculture and science, and it was kind of everything I loved, and I really took her seriously.
And so no inkling at all of agriculture or any of that with your initial studies in biology. I mean, it was all a surprise with sort of the experience in Costa Rica?
Definitely. I was interested in agriculture. I always had maybe dreams of farming my own tomatoes, but what I really was interested was more ecology and doing something for the environment, maybe studying pine beetles that are attacking all the trees in Colorado. I was kind of more focused on the academic and research side of biology.
So keep going down the path. So now you're starting to experience some of these harvests. You get into the winemaking thing. Like, it's still a far cry from kind of where you are today. So what's the winding path to get you to Spain and to the Colorado projects?
Definitely. So after college, I applied. I realized what you do to kind of break into the wine industry is you work harvests. So I applied to a bunch of different wineries to work harvests, and Joseph Phelps was the first winery that gave me a shot. And it's funny because that's one of the most esteemed wineries in Napa Valley. I had never even visited a winery or done a tasting before I had showed up. So it was definitely overwhelming the first weeks. So when you're a harvest intern is how you start out in the wine industry. You're basically a glorified cleaner of the winery. You're sanitizing tanks, you're sanitizing the winery equipment, you're digging out all the used grape skins, washing down the floor. But then you're also kind of witnessing what the winemakers are doing, what decisions they're making, what goes into making this beautiful product. And so I started out at Joseph Phelps and I fell in love with the work. I actually loved doing all this cleaning. I loved all the decision making. I loved kind of the rhythm of, okay, the grapes come in the morning. We do fermentation. We take temperatures. We do punch downs and pump overs, all these things. And so I asked some friends who were also harvest interns in Napa. I was like, well, this is ending in November. What do you guys do the rest of the year? And this Argentinian guy told me, oh, we all go to New Zealand.
I mean, it sounds very much like the baking industry where, I mean, it's all routine and monotony, and some of us love it. Like, that's the most romantic, appealing part about what we do is that it's the same every day, and you're taking nothing and turning it into something. And there's no question. I mean, I always tell people, like, 3 days in, you're either run screaming and you'll never want to do it again, or you're hooked, and that's sort of the end of it. And it sounds like you got hooked.
Definitely. And I think most people actually get hooked by the wine first. They're either aficionados that love wine so much that they get into making it, or they come from families who've been making wines for generations. And I kind of feel like the oddball in that I fell in love with working in wine before I really had a deep appreciation for it.
Have you since fallen in love with the wine itself?
Of course. Yeah. I think, starting out when I was 22, it was a little bit intimidating. Everyone was throwing around these words during tastings that I didn't know, bringing up different regions in France that I had never heard of. So I think it just took me a few years and just being exposed to it all to really fall in love with wine.
So you follow the harvests around the world. Is that for a couple of years you did that? Or how long did you do this sort of kind of intern experience?
I did it for, a couple of years. I went down to New Zealand, returned to Napa Valley, went down to Chile. And kind of after Chile, I was like, you know what? I'm done bouncing around everywhere. But I also wanted a higher up position in the wineries. And I found a master's program in Europe that was 1 year in France and then 1 year in Spain. And I signed up for that. So still ended up bouncing around the world through my master's.
So are those competitive programs? I mean, was that a hard program to get into? I guess in the States, we've got UC Davis. I mean, there's a couple of places that do it. But in Europe, I would think that it's an incredibly kind of competitive field to get into.
It was competitive. And one of the reasons that attracted me to it was I had spent so much time making wine in newer winemaking countries, New Zealand, California, Chile. And so I was interested in getting the European perspective. And it was a really interesting group of people in my master's. There were students from Greece, Argentina, China, Italy, the US. And so it was a really awesome group and about 15 people.
All taught in French and Spanish, or was it taught in English?
So the first year was in France and everything was taught in English. And then the second year, we all split up to go to different European countries. And after spending a year in France, I spoke terrible French. It was really hard. And I was almost fluent in Spanish at that point. And so I decided to go to Madrid and study there. And that program was in Spanish. So I had to get with the program really fast.
And so once you finished that program, what was the next step? So now, because you're still in Madrid now, or at least parts of the year.
Yes. So I was in Madrid and it really took me by surprise. I was super focused on going back to the US. The whole reason I did this master's was so that I could move up in the ranks in the wine industry in California, perhaps find a cushy assistant winemaking job, learn a ton at a specific estate there. And so I'm living in Madrid and realized that I was having so much fun. I had incredible roommates, made a good group of friends. I met my boyfriend. So kind of my personal life was thriving. And I also felt like it would be interesting to not only study, but maybe get some work experience in Madrid. So I started looking for jobs. Little did I know how difficult it is to get a job in Spain in general. They have a super high unemployment rate. And I was also there on a student visa. So I wasn't really sure what to do. And I met this winemaker named Fabio Bartolome, who's well known in the natural winemaking world. And I met him at this party and he said, "Oh, you should come visit my winery sometime." So I went just to kind of check it out and told him that I wanted to stay, but I didn't know how. And he offered that I could help him work his harvest, so help him make his wine. And in return, he would let me make my own wine in his winery and pay for the grapes and the supplies and everything. So we had this kind of handshake deal and I decided to stay.
So just quickly for me, just so that I understand, can you define natural wine versus, I'm not going to say unnatural wine, but versus, traditional or the rest of the industry?
Definitely. And I think most of us are, a lot of people in the wine industry hate that it has to be called natural because then it makes it seem like the rest of wine isn't natural when it totally is. But the problem with natural wine is that there's no clear definition and anyone can sort of interpret it how they would like. But I would say the standard definition for natural wine is that it is made from organically and sustainably farmed grapes. That's one of the strongest criteria.
Organic or organic or? Because, bread is sort of very similar. We have sort of this all natural versus the rest of it, but it doesn't necessarily, but there can be some conventional flours as long as they're, unbromated. We don't need to get into the baking side of it, but it's to your point, it's a very unclear definition. But for natural wine, is it organic and sustainable, or can it be either or?
I would say either or, especially too, because there's a lot of vineyards that aren't certified organic, but by all means are farming very sustainably. And on the other side, there are farms that are certified organic, but they're tilling the soil and they're, doing things that are pretty maximum intervention. And so there's the farming side, which you want to be sustainable at least. And then there's the winemaking side where you try to have the most minimal intervention within the winery. So a lot of times that means a lot of wine nowadays is fermented with commercially dried yeast. And that's often because when grapes aren't farmed organically, the natural yeast cultures that live on the skins of the grapes don't really exist anymore and they can't naturally ferment the grape juice into wine. But if you have really solid organic grapes, that yeast culture will turn your grape juice into perfect wine. So using the natural yeast on the skins and then also not adding any additives to enhance the fermentation or any sulfur that acts as preservatives or antioxidants. And so it's kind of up to interpretation. There's some people that, add a little bit of sulfur as an antioxidant and antibacterial so that their wine can age longer. And then there are other natural winemakers that don't do absolutely anything to their wine. If I could make an example, I think that especially you would appreciate, it's sort of like bread from a bakery versus the grocery store.
Sure.
Bread in the grocery store, you're going to have to add some different preservatives or additives to make it shelf stable. But bread from a bakery has very different standards. And yeah, it might go stale in a day or two, but that's because you're not adding any of these components to it.
And to your point, there's always degrees of all of that. So there's enzymes that we can add that are quote unquote all natural that can help preserve softness in a hamburger bun because our customer has needs, for a soft hamburger bun. So I get it. So you're part of growing the grapes at Fabio's vineyard, and then you're making wine from those grapes? Are they single estate? I mean, you're producing everything from there, or are you, when you're making wine, these wines that you're producing there, are you buying grapes from other folks?
I am buying grapes from other people. So I, have visited the wineries in this area and have met the growers and am involved in the vineyard practice, but I'm not farming myself. It's definitely a step I would like to take here, but I moved to Spain 3 years ago, and having a vineyard property in my name, or even leasing a vineyard, is still on the list of things to do.
As you look at the industry as a whole, and I'm pretty naive to winemaking, are most folks that are making wine buying grapes and not doing the farming piece, or are the majority of folks farm and creating wine from what they're growing? I mean, can you, kind of looking at the industry, can you put it
Yeah.
into percentages or something?
It totally depends. I would say in Europe, the majority of wine, the winery at least has some of the grapes are their own, that they're farming themselves. And especially the smaller the estate, and if it's a family estate, you can bet that those are estate grown grapes. In the US, I would say it definitely depends on region. I feel like Napa Valley, a lot of times it's estate grown fruit, or at least a mixture. But it's interesting. I think on the one hand, there's huge value in farming your own grapes because you have control over the process, and you have just a deeper understanding of the land. And people find it very beautiful when you're doing something start to finish, right? You carried that vine from its infancy to 15 years from now, where it's producing beautiful fruit, and you're making vintage after vintage of those grapes. But I also think in today's economy, and especially for younger generations like myself, land ownership is a huge issue, especially in the US. And so for young people to make wine, a lot of times they're buying fruit from growers. And there's also a lot of farmers that grow grapes and just do not want to make wine, which I totally understand. It's a huge undertaking. So there's also really beautiful relationships between winemakers and grape growers. And it's not just a purchase, like he grows the fruit, I buy it, and I make the wine. It's a dialogue and a communication, which is awesome.
That sounds really cool. So this is your second vintage, or what year are we at now in Madrid in terms of you making wine under your own label?
So I am starting my third vintage. Harvest will happen in about a week and a half or so. So it's coming.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And then you'll harvest. And how long does the process take before it's drinkable? Is that about a year?
It's about a year. Yeah. So you harvest the grapes in, mid-August to mid-September. Fermentation takes about 2 weeks. And then it's really just a year of babysitting the wine, then bottling it, letting it rest in bottle for a while, and then labels and selling it.
So talk a little bit about the kind of the bet that you have to make on that wine in terms of how do you know how much to make? Are you making as much as you can afford to make? Is it a calculated quantity that you're producing based on what you think you can sell? Like, how do you make that decision as you go into your third year? And maybe talk a little bit about how it went the first 2 years, and then sort of how you're looking at year 3.
That's a great question, because it's something like that was on my to-do list today, was think about how much wine I'm going to make this year and what's the plan. So I would say my first year, when I was sharing this winery with Fabio, working for him, making my own wine, it kind of just came about naturally. I was sort of privy to what grapes were available, and I was also using his equipment. So it was, what tanks did he have available? So I made about 1,000 bottles of wine, 200 bottles of white wine, and 800 bottles of red. The second year,
how did year 1 go?
It went great. I'm super satisfied with the wines. It was my first time making quote unquote natural wine. And so after having worked years in these bigger wineries and Napa and Chile, New Zealand, where there was this element of control, this was the first time where I kind of let nature do its work. And so I was really happy with the result. It's very different from what I thought I was going to make. But the red wine, it's a very light red wine with beautiful fruit. And the white wine, it has some skin contact. So it's an orange wine with this really interesting salinity to it. So I'm happy about it.
Are they still selling? Like, I mean, you obviously sell wine for a couple of years, right? I mean, you'll move it until it's gone. But how's the sales piece gone from the year one harvest?
The sales piece has been okay. I definitely feel I have so much experience in the viticulture, farming part, as well as the winemaking part. Sales wasn't something my master's really focused on. And so definitely working on it. I've gotten the wine into a few restaurants in Madrid, which is exciting. And I've also been able to sell it to friends and family and word of mouth here in Spain. I am working on getting it to the US because I know if I can just get it into the US, it'll sell no problem with the community I have and the culture that the US has and just buying wine and drinking it at home and everything. So I'm looking for an importer right now. So sales are going okay. I'm really missing the piece of getting it to the US.
And how, I mean, obviously, what's the biggest challenge with making that happen?
Yeah.
Is it the regulations or is it finding the importer?
Both, because the regulations are so strict that you need, I would be an importer myself, but it's just crazy the amount of permits and licenses you have. So you have to get an importer's license. But with that license, you can get the wine to your state, but then you can't sell it anywhere outside of your state. And you also can't sell it directly to consumers. So then you have to find a distributor. You have to get your distributor's license. And it's this whole chain of regulations that I think have started in the US post-prohibition and have just never disappeared. And what's happening now is that huge distribution companies like Southern Glazers, and they kind of had their hold on Congress, and these laws aren't really changing. So I'm looking for an importer who can kind of negotiate all of that for me and help me sell it, and who already has these licensees. And I think I have a few options, which is exciting. And you just also have to have someone take a bet on you. I don't have a huge amount of product. It's not going to be their most, there's not a ton to sell. The margins aren't huge, but you have to find someone who just loves wine and loves the story.
So unlike bread and everything else, there's no direct-to-consumer online option because of all the regulations, right? We can't just, those of us in St. Louis that are interested can't just order a bottle of wine online and have it shipped here.
Unfortunately, no. I have looked into it. There is a service that does that for Spanish wine here to the US. The problem is that shipping comes down to $20 a bottle or something. And that's sort of, if nothing works out in a year from now, maybe I'll consider that. But I would just I wouldn't want to do that to anyone who's buying my wine either. That's too steep of a cost.
So what price point are you falling into, just out of curiosity? Like if in Madrid, what does a bottle of wine sell for?
Yeah, so I sell my white wine for 13 euros a bottle and my red wine for 18 euros a bottle, direct to consumer. And then, of course, to restaurants, I lower that a little bit.
So what about year two? Year two, how many bottles did you make?
So year two, I graduated out of Fabio's winery. So it's a really interesting story about him. He makes wine, but it's kind of his vision to repopulate this valley that we're all making wine in, with young winemakers and people who are inspired and want to carry on this legacy. So he opened up a big cooperative in a different town and is renting it out to myself and about 8 other young winemakers from Madrid. So we all moved into this shared space, and we share wine presses and distemmers and pumps and materials. And we're also there to give each other a hand if there's anything heavy to lift or pick up things. So that's where I made wine my second year. And I actually cut down on production. I made about 600 bottles of red wine from the same fruit that I had used the year before. And I cut back just because I wasn't sure where this project was going. I was in between visas. So before I had had a student visa, which I definitely was not supposed to be making wine and starting a business on that, which is kind of out of character of me to take such a risk, but I did. And I was waiting for my papers to get my long-term residency in Spain. And at this point, I just didn't want to make a huge amount of wine, knowing that with all of this up in the air. So I made about 600 bottles in Spain, and my papers finally came through, and I immediately went home to Colorado to visit my family. And it turned out that that's when the harvest was happening in Colorado. And I asked the winemaker who I used to work for back in the day there if I could make some Colorado wine at his cellar. And he said yes. And it sort of solved my problem. I really wanted to get wine to everyone I know and love in the US. And so this felt like a cool option where I was home anyways and could make some wine for my friends and family.
And that was last year you did that? Or did you do
That was
that again this year?
So it was last year, and I made a Colorado Cabernet Franc from a nearby vineyard, and it'll be ready to sell in September. I made about 1,000 bottles. I'm contemplating doing it again this year, but I don't have a trip planned home. And it's also something where it's a joint venture in which I'm making the decisions, I'm making the wine, but there's very much someone else hands-on doing the work. And I'm trying to understand how I like that.
Right.
You know, how does that feel authentic to me? Will it feel authentic when I'm selling it? Or am I being too strict about that? And should I just make it because it's fun? So
as you look ahead to this third year, are you now you've got the long-term visa, so you're that kind of piece is off the table. How will you approach the decision as to how much wine to make?
Yeah, so this has.
I know it's top of mind because you mentioned it was on the to-do list today. So I'm just kind of curious how you think about it. I mean, I know you don't have the answer, but as you start to put that and put that framework together, it's something that all folks in kind of a startup phase, I mean, that's the biggest thing because it's money, it's time, it's energy, and you just have to, and that especially when you're producing a product that takes time to come to market, you know, you don't just make wine and then tomorrow you're selling it. I mean, it's got to sit and age. And so it's tying up funds and opportunities. How do you think about it?
Totally. I mean, there's a quote about starting a wine business. The best way to make a small fortune in wine is starting with a big one. So, yeah, I mean, you kind of laid it out. There's just so many barriers to entry, right? You have one chance every year to make one product, and then you have to sit on that for 1 to 2 years. If you're making a light red wine, then you can bottle it and sell it in 1 year. If you're making a heavy red wine, you're waiting for it to age at least 2 years. And so I'm actually changing wineries again this year.
So you're out of the co-op.
I'm out of the co-op. It was fun. It was an amazing story, and I loved working with everyone. We all have different standards of cleanliness.
Sure. No, I can imagine bringing 8 winemakers together that there's a lot of issues and.
Mm-hmm. And I found a new winery in Malaga in the south of Spain where my boyfriend's from. I think we might move here one day. So it's sort of trying to look ahead towards the future, even though I loved the region where I was working in Spain. And so this new winery has plenty of space. I can make as much wine as I would like, which is great because the more wine you make, the better your margins are, right? You know, so the amount of wine I'm making right now, I have pretty low margins, especially considering it's such a handcrafted product. And so once you get to about 5,000 bottles, 10,000 bottles, it starts to really become profitable, which is my goal within the next 3 or 4 years. However, this year I have a new fun predicament, which is that this winery doesn't have the permission to sell the wine that's made for another 2 to 3 years. So however much wine I make there, I'll be sitting on that profit and on that investment for at least 2 to 3 years. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, Spanish bureaucracy takes a really long time. So I think I'm thinking about making 1,500 bottles, 2,000 bottles, growing a little bit this year, but just having it be something where I know I don't need the return on investment immediately.
So what keeps you up at night? Like what's the thing that scares you the most about and obviously the having to hold on to it for a couple of years, it certainly would be a big one, but are there other things that keep you up or make you nervous?
Oh my God, this whole thing, all of it, you know? I, yeah, I think starting a wine business in general, similar to the restaurant industry, you know, it's just one of those industries that's notorious for being very beautiful and an amazing passion project, but it's not always the most logical. And I'm a very logical person, and I know that this can work, but it's definitely, you're constantly hearing people that are a little bit disillusioned with the industry. So that's kind of always in your ear. And so what's keeping me up at night is kind of quieting down those thoughts and then also just wading through the Spanish bureaucracy. I mean, it took a while to get my visa, which I now have for 5 years, which is nice. I have to start from zero to get my driver's license here. So I'm in Spanish driver's ed. I passed my permit test, which was way more intensive than it was in St. Louis when I was 16 years old. I was studying the rules of the road in Spain for like 3 months before I could take this test. And I have to do the driving classes and everything. So this whole time I've been taking the bus to the winery and the vineyard, which is kind of cool that in Spain there's this amazing public transportation system that can get you from the center of Madrid to these far-flung towns in the middle of the vineyards. But yeah, just kind of managing to grow this business while also adapting to life in a foreign country.
Sure. And one of the things you've got some wonderful blog posts on your website, and I read it. And the one I think most recently was about the sense of place and sort of that idea that winemaking has always been about a sense of place, right? This is where we grow, like you mentioned before, like the whole idea of growing and fermenting and doing it all in one place, but how hard it is and how difficult it is. And so how do you find that sense of place in the new economy? And so as you start to think about that, but at the same time have to think about where's my business going to be in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years as you get something started, how do you kind of wrestle with that? Because I mean, you mentioned this might be the place we would want to live, so we're going to try it out now. And I mean, is owning and farming a goal, or do you see an opportunity for just to continue doing what you're doing, or does thoughts of coming back to the States, like kind of, and I know you don't have to answer all the questions now, but when you tie a business together, it's different because now you sort of, you kind of put a little bit, I've always described it as putting a backpack on that you can't really ever take off. And sometimes there's a book sticking in your back, and sometimes it's uncomfortable, and sometimes the weight's well distributed and it's not a problem, and it all kind of changes. But it definitely is, it's a part of the decision that somebody who's just picking where to live doesn't necessarily have to wrestle with.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I feel like that's life's biggest conundrum for me right now, because you're right. When you start a business, you're planting roots, and especially a wine business, it's so steeped in place. And especially from the consumer's standpoint, when you have a wine brand and they're drinking your wine, there's this expectation that you're deeply connected to your land and that you're out there farming it and living with the seasons and making your wine each year. And the year before was cooler, and so the vintage is cooler. And last year was a really hot year, and the wine reflects that. And it's important to be in one place and reflect that within your wine. And so there's this extra pressure to find the right place and connect with it in a way that I think people who work in other industries don't experience. I mean, even if you have an online business or a brand, and, you know, I'm often jealous of my friends who are nurses and teachers. They can pick up and move anywhere, right? There's always a need for that in any place. And so when I think about where I want to live, right now we're thinking maybe moving to Malaga in the south, and it's a beautiful place that's on the ocean and there's the mountains behind it and a really interesting wine scene. At the same time, I'm in a new country. I've visited here plenty, but I've never lived in this part of Spain. And then you also think about winemaking, and it always happens in a more rural area outside of the city. And I'm 30. I don't have any kids yet, but that's on the horizon for me someday. So, what are the schools like in this rural communities? Or can I magically find a vineyard that's close enough to a city that I can commute to? It's all of these factors that you kind of have to figure out. And it's this weird dynamic where I feel really ready to just put everything I have into this business on a professional side. But on the personal side, I still, I haven't thrown out moving back to the US. It's something maybe that I would like to do. So really kind of thinking about that. And I guess the goal is that within the next 2 years, I really figure that out. And then within 10 years, I'm producing vintage after vintage of wine, and not just growing the wine, but growing a community around it.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing, and I'll just, as someone who's been baking for 31 years in St. Louis, it's part of your business begins to also define part of the community, and then your community helps you define your business. So I don't know that you're ever going to find the perfect place, and I don't know that you even have to spend too much energy worrying about that. Like you want it to be a wonderful place to raise a family. Like I get all of those things, and I'm not discounting it, but I also think that you can get overwhelmed by trying to drop it into the perfect place. And yet in many respects, like the grapes and the farm and the land, your business starts to create that sense of community, especially when you're producing something that people are consuming. And so, bread and wine, I believe, are kind of similar in that. And it's interesting that, in looking back, I don't know that I ever would have picked to move back to St. Louis and to do this, but in hindsight, I never could have done this if it wasn't in St. Like it wouldn't be the same, because the community has made it. It's all together and kind of part of the whole deal. And I think it's a wonderful aspect of the opportunity that you have sitting in front of you. So I'm excited for you, but I think you can do it wherever you find home to be, and it starts to become a big piece of that.
That's such a relief to hear. And thinking about your company and business and what you've done, it seems like you've also made the choice that you made the right one. Like the power is completely in your hands to make it feel right.
Yeah, and I think but the community helps that, and I think the community is a big piece of that, and so it's really a wonderful aspect of it. So what do you do when you're not making wine? Because obviously it's a pretty all-encompassing, at least certainly parts of the year. How do you relax and recharge outside of the vineyard?
Yeah, so I was just in Colorado visiting my family the past few weeks. So I did a ton of mountain biking with my family, which it's so beautiful out there and amazing to get out in the mountains and nature. So lots of mountain biking and time outside. In Spain, I think we're going to go to the beach this weekend. So just really enjoying nature, seeing friends, eating at great restaurants. Yeah.
So for the 1,000 bottles that are going to be available in Colorado, if folks were interested in trying to try your wine, how would they do it here in the States?
Yeah, so that is my tiny victory, or not tiny, that's a huge victory for me right now, is I have all the permission to sell the wine I made in Colorado anywhere in the US. So that will become available, I think, mid-September. And I'll have it on my website. You can order it and have it shipped to any of the 50 states. But I'm also thinking about coming back to St. Louis and doing some tastings and events and being able to kind of deliver the wine in person there. So,
well, please let me know when you're coming, and we can kind of help get the word out that you'll be in St. Louis.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm hoping maybe right after Thanksgiving, but I'll let you know once we kind of have the official plans.
Well, Nicole, it's super exciting to hear what you're up to over there and over here as well. But I really appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day today to share the story with us. It's really cool. I'm super inspired by what you're doing, and I wish you all the luck in the world.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really nice to talk to you, and it was a great conversation. And now I know I can reach out to you for for plenty of advice.
Absolutely. I'm here for you anytime. Have a great day.
Thanks. You too.
Thanks so much for joining me today. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed sharing these insights from folks I truly admire. Be sure and follow the show in your favorite podcast player to be alerted to newly released episodes. And share a comment if you have any feedback or future contributor recommendations.